Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. There is so much news coming out of West Asia that it is difficult to know what to cover and what to table for now. I thought about it for a while, and I have decided to focus on two separate stories. One is about the increasing tension between Israel and Iran, and the other is a perspective on World War III, where three different writers give their analysis of whether we are in or on the verge of entering World War III. And I will talk more about that when we get to that second story. But to start out with Iran, as was anticipated, Israel launched so-called retaliatory strikes on Iran today. Now, I don't even like that term retaliatory strike because the retaliatory strike was what Iran did. Iran made the retaliatory strike on Israel after Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. I think it is much more logical to say that there is simply now an Israeli-Iranian war, just like there is an Israeli-Hamas war or terrorist campaign, whichever you like. I guess it's both. But it's frightening what's happening now with Iran. No one knows what will happen. The expectation is that if Iran does react or respond to this latest attack, it will wait until the end of the month. But we'll have to see what happens. Tensions are ratcheting up so quickly. Every day brings new developments that making a prediction saying that things won't change until the end of the month, Iran won't respond until the end of the month, well, that may make sense today and make absolutely no sense tomorrow. It is a real tragedy. This war was literally started by Iran. Iran is the provocateur, not, I'm sorry, Israel is the provocateur, not Iran. And Israel seems intent on doing whatever it wants to do. I don't know if there are additional strikes that Israel plans for Iran, or if this is it. It is really hard to tell with that far right-wing Likud-led government under Benjamin Netanyahu. But all we can do is take it day by day and try to avoid too much speculation about the future, because when you are in a war, you really can't speculate that much. You can try, but speculations are almost always wrong in the fog of war, because you may think that something has happened, and then on further investigation, you may find out that it did not. Or you may expect a country to react to a strike or an attack, but then the country does not. So there really is no way of making any kind of real empirical predictions on what is going to happen in either the war between Israel and Iran, or the war, or as I prefer, terrorist campaign between Israel and Hamas and Gaza, really. But we'll start with the one against Iran, since that is the newest thing, and then we'll move on and talk about these other people who have made their own speculations about World War III. Let me say first that I dislike fear tactics. There's no reason for them. If somebody is going to talk about World War III, and I have no objection to that in principle, it needs to be based on clear evidence. I know that throughout my lifetime, many people, both journalists, sociologists, and others, have predicted that World War III would start as the result of a particular military action, and it did not. And so often, always so far, predictions of World War III have been wrong. And let's hope that these predictions are wrong as well. But again, we don't know. Could it happen? Of course, it could happen. But should we be talking about it? That is a debatable point. I think that we should, because it is better to be informed of possibilities than to be uninformed. I know that there will be some people out there who will disagree with me, and that's fine, you can. But as a sociologist, I see my role as presenting information, not making a judgment as to whether some information should not be presented because it may offend the views or sensibilities of some of my viewers. I feel that I need to give whatever information I have to people and let people make up their own minds. Obviously, again, I cannot cover everything. I'm only a single guy. I have no staff. I'm sitting here in my dining room. That's it. That is my equipment, my computer, my microphone, my webcam. I have nothing else. And so I'm simply doing this as best I can without any assistance from anyone else. But we'll start with the story about Iran, and then we'll go on from there. I'll put on my spectacles once again so I can read this thing and begin with the story about Iran. This is obviously this is not unsurprising. It was predicted and correctly predicted, but it is disappointing nonetheless. The title of the article: Israeli missile hits Iran, U.S. officials confirm. Two U.S. officials confirmed to CBS News that an Israeli missile has hit Iran. The strike follows last weekend's retaliatory drone and missile attack against Israel, which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to respond to, and now he has. Officials were tight-lipped about the location or extent of the Israeli strike. When reached by CBS News, the Israeli Defense Forces had no comment on the attack. The Iranian state-run IRNA news agency said air defense batteries fired across several provinces. It did not elaborate on what caused the batteries to fire, though people across the area reported hearing the sounds. In particular, IRNA said air defenses fired at a major site in Esfahan, which long has been home to Iran's fleet of American-made F-14 Tomcats purchased before the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The semi-official Fars and Tasnim news agencies also reported the sound of blasts without giving a cause. State television acknowledged loud noise in the area. Esfahan is also home to sites associated with Iran's nuclear program, including its underground Natanz enrichment site, which has been repeatedly targeted by suspected Israeli attacks. However, state television described all sites in the area as fully safe. Thank goodness for that. Dubai-based carriers, Emirates and Fly Dubai, began diverting around Western Iran around 4:30 a.m. local time. They offered no explanation, though local warnings of aviators suggested the airspace may have been closed. Iran later announced it grounded commercial flights in Tehran and across areas of western and central regions. Loudspeakers informed customers of the incident at Imam Khomeini International Airport in Tehran. Online videos purported to show. Iran last weekend launched an unprecedented retaliatory strike against Iran in response to a deadly attack on an Iranian consulate in Syria, which killed 7 officers, including 2 generals from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran's attack on Israel included 170 drones, over 30 cruise missiles, and 120 ballistic missiles, according to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and US officials. None of the drones crossed into Israeli territory before they were shot down by Israel and its allies, including the US. And I would add, not only including the US, but including Jordan and the United Arab Emirates. The Israeli Defense Forces said 5 of the ballistic missiles struck Israel, with 4 of them hitting Israel's Nevatim Air Base, where Israel's F-35s are based, U.S. officials told CBS News. The officials believe the base was likely Iran's primary target, as the strike against the consulate in Syria is believed to have been carried out by an F-35. The U.S. and other allies of Israel have urged Netanyahu to exercise restraint in any possible response to Iran. U.S. officials have said the country would not participate in any Israeli retaliatory strike. Let's see if that holds up. In the aftermath of Iran's attack, which the IDF said caused very little damage, President Biden pressed the Israeli Prime Minister, quote, to think about what that success says all by itself to the rest of the region, end quote. According to National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby. That is the end of that story. There is a bit more known in addition to that, but that provides a summary of the essentials. There is so far, as I said, been no response by Iran. Many people predict that will not happen until after the Jewish holy days are over at the end of the month, which is nice. At least Iran is showing respect for the religious festivals of Israel. I wish the same respect were being shown by Israel for Iran and its own religious festivals, especially back during Ramadan, which of course was not. So anyway, it's difficult to make sense out of this whole thing. I realize that it is tragic. We don't know what will happen with it, but I suppose that is where this next story might be informative. And again, as I said, I am reluctant to discuss stories, predictions about World War III, because so many of them have been made over the years, and obviously everyone has been false. There has never been a third world war, but the past is no predictor of the present or the future. And just the fact that no third world war has happened yet is no guarantee that it will not happen at some time in the future, or even in the present. Okay, so this story is from Sky News, which used to be owned by Fox News, but is now owned by CNN. There's another Sky News in Australia, which is owned by Fox News, but this Sky News is in the UK, and as I said, is owned by the same company that owns CNN. So it's a sister station to CNN. The headline: Are we heading for World War III? Experts give their verdicts. And here is the sub-headline: International allies are counseling restraint after the Iranian barrage against Israel, and Russia continues to make gains in Ukraine. So are we on the cusp of another world war? Sky News asks experts to weigh in. Here is the beginning of the story. In a world that has grown more dangerous in recent years, the nightmare scenario of a third world war is in the public consciousness. Well, pause for a second. The fact that it is in the public consciousness is meaningless. I don't care personally what is in the public consciousness, except if I'm doing opinion research. What I care about is what the evidence shows, not public opinion, not whether if you ask the average person on the street, that person says, yes, I think there will be, or I think there won't be a third world war in the immediate future or in the distant future. I would then ask that person what evidence that person is using. And most likely, because I've seen this done, when a person is asked that question, the person will have no response or will simply walk away. Back to the story. Earlier this year, UK Defense Secretary Grant Shapps warned the world could be engulfed by wars, including China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, in the next 5 years, and said we are moving from a post-war to a pre-war period. The relief felt at the ends of the Cold War in the late 1980s has been replaced with increasing alarm at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there is outcry at the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which, parenthetically, just got worse today. And it seems to get worse every day. So the crisis in Gaza should not be regarded as being eclipsed by this new war between Israel and Iran. Please, please, please do not forget Gaza. Do not forget Gaza. Do not allow the events taking place between Israel and Iran to create a fog around the events taking place in Gaza. Sky News spoke to experts about whether World War III is a possibility and if we really are living in a pre-war world. Here is what they had to say. The international order is fraying. I think that would be agreed upon by most experts, at least the ones that I am familiar with, including in my own field of sociology. It is fraying. Immanuel Wallerstein, a sociologist and the developer of world systems analysis, has spoken about that and written about that extensively. And he has said about maybe 2 years ago that he thinks that the current world system, the capitalist world system, only has at most 30 years to go. I personally would not give it that long, but no one can know. No one can know that. But I am somewhat skeptical of the 30 years number. I just don't see any evidence that 30 years is a realistic number. I think a much shorter time frame makes more sense to me. Hugh Lovett, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations think tank. He is the one who said that the current international order is fraying. Continuing, the reassuring news is that we are not heading towards the Third World War, he says. While there are conflicts in various theaters, Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, these are all separate and are not connected, according to Mr. Lovett. The Gaza war has been going on for 6 months and is driving regional escalation. Iran's retaliation against Israel is just the latest example of this. There are implications for the international community, including the UK, for example, in terms of the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping and the impact that has on global trade. There is, he thinks, a risk that British troops become sucked into a conflict in the Middle East. We need to see these risks in a certain context, which is they do impact the UK, but they are not existential risks, meaning they are not threats to the existence of the UK. This is also happening at a time when the international order is fraying under considerable strain. This is something that we should be very troubled by. More likely now than at any time since the end of the last World War. That prediction was made by Deborah Hayes, who is the Sky News security and defense editor. So we will now turn to her own evaluation of whether we are heading toward a third world war. Given the scale of turmoil shaking parts of the globe, in particular in Ukraine and the Middle East, the potential for a spark that ignites World War III already exists. That does not mean an escalation to global confrontation is inevitable, but it is arguably more likely now than at any time since the end of the last World War. A decision by Iran to launch an unprecedented barrage of missiles and drones against Israel has just raised the stakes even higher. Israel has vowed to respond through its allies, and of course that response, or at least part of that response, has already occurred, continuing, including the UK and the US, are urging restraint, especially as they helped ensure the vast majority of incoming munitions were blasted out of the sky before they could cause harm on the ground. Pause for a second. Will that affect the thinking of Benjamin Netanyahu? I doubt it. Benjamin Netanyahu is not what I would call a compassionate man, a man who cares about the good deeds of others and says, let me pay you back for what you did for my country. He is a Machiavellian, and I would even argue perhaps a sadist, although I'm using sadist in a non-psychoanalytic sense, just the ordinary sense of somebody who desires to inflict harm on others. Should Israel choose to retaliate, which of course it has, the crisis could yet be contained if its return strike is limited and any further Iranian response triggered by such an attack is also curbed. But they are two big ifs. Indeed, they are two big ifs. Continuing. Also, every time even limited military action is taken, there is the risk of error or miscalculation that leads to uncontrolled escalation to regional war. What happens in the Middle East also has a global impact, especially because Iran is backed by Russia and has close ties to China, also to North Korea, which is not mentioned here, but of course there is an alliance between Iran and nuclear weapon, I should say, powered North Korea, while Israel's strongest allies, led by the US, are predominantly Western nations, but not exclusively. Jordan and the UAE obviously are not Western, and yet they seem to be defenders of the existence, such as it is, of Israel. Continuing, it means the crisis pitches authoritarian states against democracies, just as the concurrent war in Europe does. Pause. The use of the term democracies here is, I think, troublesome. I would definitely not regard Israel as a democracy. Israel has increasingly been taking rights away, for example, from the Arabs living within its own country. And I'm not talking about people living in the Palestinian territories. I'm talking about Arabs who are Israeli citizens. They are increasingly losing their rights. Before the Voting Act was passed in the US, giving African Americans the guaranteed or almost guaranteed right to vote in the US, a right which has been increasingly taken away from them. I would argue, and many people have argued as well, that the US was not really much of a democracy either. Plus, as a Marxist, I would say that even if the US, Britain, Israel, whatever, can be called democracies, they are bourgeois democracies, meaning they are democracies which serve the interests of the capitalists, and in particular of the war machine, the military-industrial complex, to use Dwight Eisenhower's term from his farewell address. In case you didn't know, that's where it comes from. It is a quotation from Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address. But the term democracies, no. Where is there a democracy? Where is there a democracy? I would challenge anyone to show me a democracy, a true democracy, anywhere in the world. I simply do not think that they exist, at least as I would define the term democracy. Despite vows of Western support, Russia is slowly gaining ground in Ukraine. Western allies are failing to deliver the weapons and ammunition the Ukrainian military needs, leading to an almost inevitable retreat unless the balance of military strength on the ground changes. Pause. That is a story which has been neglected in recent months, largely, I think, because of Israel's terrorist campaign in Gaza. Many people before that time assumed that Ukraine would win. And perhaps many of you thought that Ukraine would win. I don't know who you are, but that view is beginning to rapidly change. Russia, not Ukraine, now has the upper hand, and a major part of it. There is only so much money. I mean, how much money can countries give to any other country? We are already, as the Western world, giving tons of money to support the Zionist entity. That leaves little for Ukraine. And so as a result, Ukraine is now in a losing position. Now, do I care? Yes and no. I mean, I hope that people will be safe. I hope that people who are Ukrainian, who are now exiled in different countries, are able to return safely to their homes. Do I care whether Ukraine is ruled by Russia or by NATO? No, that I do not care about, because I see both of them as authoritarian bodies who care only about imposing their own will on other countries. In effect, they are both colonial or imperialistic powers. So no, I do not care which side wins, but I do care about the Ukrainians. Those are the ones I care about, not about whether Russia or NATO wins the war being fought to protect or supposedly protect Ukraine. It means that the crisis pitches a thought. Well, I've already read that part. Success by Vladimir Putin may embolden the Russian president, whose country is on a total war footing, to test the strength of the NATO alliance by invading a member state. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Again, this would create a direct war between authoritarian Moscow, armed by Iran, North Korea, and also with the assistance of China, against the West's NATO alliance. Evidence that military force has proved effective against Western powers could further harden China's resolve to make good on a pledge to reunite the islands of Taiwan with the mainland, even if that means invading. Such a move could also plunge Asia into conflict, again along the same dividing line of authoritarian states, pardon me, versus democracies. This next quotation, basically just 3 words, comes from Edward R. Arnold, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, called RUSI think tank. He uses the term subversion of attention. He says, I think people really need to understand what the North Atlantic Treaty is, which is the foundation of NATO, he says. In a sense, that's true, but really the foundation of NATO is a provision in the United Nations, which allows bodies like NATO to be established and bodies like the former Warsaw Pact to be established as well. Mr. Arnold argues that the public seem to believe that NATO's Article 5, the principle that an attack on one member is triggered as an attack on all, is automatic. That's not the case, or certainly does not have to be the case. Escalation is not automatic, and there are measures to de-escalate things. Pause. Yes, that is true. The first time that Article 5 was invoked was by the US following 9/11, but it was literally invoked by the US. US did not have to invoke it. Now, whether a particular nation, not the US, which basically runs NATO, whether their invocation of Article 5 will have the same effect as the US's invocation is a matter to be determined. No one really knows. But again, that is a very important statement. There is no automatic triggering of NATO in the result of an attack on one of its members. That is a very common misconception and I am happy that Edward Arnold has corrected it. Looking to the situation in Ukraine, where NATO has been providing weapons and assistance, he says, the risk of miscommunication between the West and Russia has increased. The chances of a miscommunication where one ship accidentally fires on another, I think that goes up. We need to be really prepared about what that means. He also argues that in some ways, the threat of a wider conflict with Russia is reducing at the moment. Kremlin forces are starting to make progress in Ukraine, but the quality of their troops has been degraded significantly, such as they are not in a position to present a threat to NATO. Mr. Arnold continued, Vladimir Putin will be looking pretty closely at what happens in the Middle East, how each nation responds, and just the diversion of attention from Ukraine. It's all helping Putin at the moment, because while focused on the Middle East, we are not as focused as we have been on Ukraine. Yes, again, that is why Ukraine is not doing as well as it was before, and why what was thought in the past to be an almost inevitable victory of Ukraine is rarely said these days. The more conflicts erupt, the more wars erupt, the more money is deployed into a particular region. Right now, the Zionist entity, the less money is available for Ukraine, and that is precisely what has happened. This next quotation comes from Dr. Luigi Scarzeri. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but I'll do my best. Scazieri, who's a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform think tank. Here is his quotation. Donald Trump could undermine NATO. Well, yes. In fact, at one time, he actually threatened to withdraw from NATO. He was talked out of it, but it seemed as though for some reason he was angry over the fact, or at least his thought, that not all member nations of NATO were paying their dues, so to speak. And so he felt, well, until they start paying their dues, I am not going to guarantee that the US will remain a member of NATO. That did not end up happening, and we are still in NATO, whether for good or for ill. But that certainly is a valid statement. Donald Trump, if he is elected president in November, could, when he comes into office in January, undermine NATO. No guarantee that he will do that. And of course, there's no guarantee that he will win, but that is certainly a realistic possibility. Continuing with the quotation from Luigi Scazieri, it depends on your definition of World War III. A possible conflict between Iran and Israel has the potential to expand into a major military conflagration in the Middle East with global implications. The US would almost certainly be drawn in on Israel's side, and other Western countries, including the UK, may do the same to a lesser extent, but their involvement would be limited, and this would not be World War III, not least as Russia can ill afford to support Iran, and because China is unlikely to. The impact of such a conflict on Europe would be primarily economic, through further disruption in energy flows and trade. The primary pathway to a World War III scenario remains a direct Western clash with Russia. That scenario will be more likely if Donald Trump wins and undermines NATO, tempting Vladimir Putin into an attack in the Baltics. A clash with Russia would also be quite likely if Western forces become involved in supporting Ukraine in frontline combat roles. That is the end of the story. So I will take off my glasses. Again, it is hard to know what to make of that second story, but my own reading of it is that the majority of the writers are basically presenting a position of uncertainty. And that is the best position that one would hope for. They are uncertain about whether we are heading toward World War III. And I genuinely hope they are correct. Nevertheless, whether you call a particular war a part of World War III or not, may in some senses be irrelevant. I mean, the fact that there is now a war between Israel and Gaza, and Israel and Iran, and Russia and Ukraine, even if they may be regarded as somewhat disconnected, although Israel is involved in two of them, they are still pretty bad in themselves, and they each pose significant possible complications for how the West and for how the entire world would deal with any possible future scenarios. And then, as we have seen in recent years, there seems to be a progression of conflicts from one to another. I guess you could call it a kind of domino effect. When one war starts, it causes instability. That is precisely what President Joseph Biden feared, and that may be the only thing that I agree with him on. He was afraid of a wider regional conflict being caused by the escalation of Israel's war or terrorist campaign on Gaza, and Israel's war, or maybe you could also say terrorist campaign, on Iran. Yes, that could happen. And in fact, I would go further than that. I would say that regional escalation has already occurred, because we are talking about a particular part of the world, West Asia. And in West Asia, there are now two separate wars being fought by the Zionist entity. And who knows where that will lead? Who knows what additional nations will be brought into it? Who knows how Israel will continue to respond to either Gaza or to Iran? Who knows what will happen in Ukraine? Who knows whether Russia will win, which now seems more likely than not, or whether NATO will win? There is simply no way of being sure on any of those issues. And so we will simply have to wait and see. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.